Hello and welcome, my name is Hoshiko, and today we are looking at Tennessee Entrance Hall by Narcissa Thorne, and we're going to be making a lighting diagram for it. Now, I did one of these a little while back that's a very similar image called the Massachusetts Parlor. Now, in that, I actually didn't realize one specific detail. It is a miniature, and that's the same thing with this one. Now, being miniatures, there probably is a lot more artificial lighting going on than what I talked about as a possibility for it being a real room that you could shoot in. So we're going to be able to just have that in the back of our minds as we work through how the lighting in this image functions. Now, as usual, and if you've ever seen one of these videos before, you probably know the drill, but if you want these filmmaker template tools that I have here at the top of my image, you can pick that up on my Patreon. I have a link for that down in the video's description. While you're there, if you want to join my Patreon, I have a free tier that tells you when I post new cinematography videos, or you can join as a paid member for as little as $2 to support these videos directly. If you want to learn how to import your own image and those filmmaker tools to Draw.io, I have a link to a video down in the description where I go over that as well. Draw.io itself is a free and open source diagramming software that I love, not only for lighting diagrams, but for other forms of like mind mapping and stories and all that kind of stuff. But let's talk about this image. So when we look at this image, now I know that it's a miniature, but I'm going to just kind of consider it to be a normal room. That way, that has the best direct application for, talking about how we can use this style of lighting. And the thing that sticks out to me first and most prominently is the idea that you have these kind of hard lines along the floor where the light comes and creates these streaks, both right here and right here. Now, this one is a harder line setup than this one, and this one is a little bit more angular, pointing towards the center of the room, while this one points more straight across. I don't know if it's an exact intention, but I think one thing that's interesting about that is that because this points a little bit towards the center, it does lead the eye up and to the center, while this one, being more centered already, just points directly to the center, directly across. In terms of other types of lighting we have here, we have these windows on the front door. Now, one thing about this is that you can see a little bit of details outside there, but really they are just kind of blown out. At the same time, they're not creating any sort of streaks across the ground or having a huge impact, but they are adding general light to our scene. And then lastly, I think it's important to point out that there's a doorway over here and there isn't any light coming through. And so that kind of tells us the tone a little bit more of the room in of itself. One more thing is that you can actually see the shadow of this chandelier on the opposite wall over here. So this light, while it's coming a little bit up and towards the center, is also coming up at enough of an angle to cast a shadow from the chandelier onto the wall all the way across. Now the same is not true the other direction, and I think that that's for kind of two reasons. It seems that this light is a little bit lower or not as angled upwards, and it's casting more directly across while this one is casting at an angle in particular. I'm going to kind of ignore the walls a little bit in terms of their color. Having all these different colors will change a little bit of how the lighting reflects, but that would also be the same kind of thing for every different location that we could go with. In this case, it is a kind of lighter blue color, so that probably would be bouncing some light. The white doors in both of these cases are definitely bouncing some more of the light around, but that's just kind of something that happens with scenes depending on what kind of decoration we're using. And, for that matter, the same goes for the ceiling. I don't think the chandelier is on. It doesn't appear that it's creating any source of light itself, but if you did need a little bit more just generalized lighting in a space like this and you had that chandelier, you could totally pop that on also. Okay, so now I'm going to build out this space using Draw.io's built-in floor plan tools. To me, this is one of the strengths of Draw.io in particular, is that it has things like this just built into the software. So that way you can kind of just easily and rapidly prototype scenes and get a layout going without too much extended effort. Okay, so that's some stairs. Now the stairs in the image do actually, curve upwards. I'm not going to be replicating that in particular in this case. I'm making the doors open where they would face the camera if we could see them. We can see this one a little bit, I think, but this one not. And I'm doing that so that when we have light that potentially is bouncing around in the scene, it can bounce more directly off of the door and just add a little bit of general lighting to our scene. And because this door is closed over here, I'm going to just have it be a solid wall. It's not creating too much of a difference in terms of how we would do a lighting diagram like this. And just so that we have some nice details, let's add in some furniture. Having these kinds of props available in Draw.io is also something that I find to be a really nice advantage of using it, because you don't have to hunt around for a lot of different props or anything like that in terms of like clip art or something. You're not having to download a whole bunch of things. This covers a lot of stuff, and if the object that you're looking for is not available here in particular, I find that there's generally something that's about the same size, and you can use that as a placeholder. For example, we don't have a little table like this, but I'm just going to put a bookcase and imagine that would be like a waist high kind of bookcase. So now with our room built out, I think we're going to first place our camera. Now we are pretty wide here, I would say. There is a good amount of distance between these, objects, and we are seeing that distance being recreated. The one thing here is that since this is a miniature, this is probably a macro lens, and some of those distances are kind of distorted through it being a macro and a miniature, depending exactly on how the scale works, those types of things. That being said, I think that if you wanted to recreate this, you could use a reasonably wide lens, somewhere south of 24 millimeters, depending exactly on the frame that you're looking for. This is also a extra tall ceiling. These are probably 7-foot doors or so, kind of a standard door height size, but we actually are having almost another length of that above. So instead of regular ceilings ending at about 10 feet, we are getting another 5 feet above. So this is probably 15-foot ceilings, and that makes sense also with this having kind of one flight of stairs before the bend and then having another half flight. So this is a 1.5 story area. And because of that, I think we are able to get our camera up to a relatively high place and look down a little bit. If you notice, the camera's kind of center point is tilted down a little bit, but I think basically if you tilted it up, it would be almost at the height of the first floor. So, we're talking about 9 or 10 feet in the air, most likely. We do appear to be slightly above the door frames. Once again, it's a miniature, so things might not be exactly the same, but we're talking about how we would light this if we had maybe a space that we had rented that we could film in, and these were the attributes of that space. Having the camera up high would be a really great opportunity to have people rush from door to door or come down the stairs. You could have the camera raise or lower with people and follow them, as they go from the front door all the way up the stairs, from this kind of, pulled back or withdrawn position of being a little bit high up and observational of their characters' movements. These are the kinds of things that we can think of. I'm going to have the camera be centered to both the chandelier and the door, kind of equidistant between both of the walls. And we're going to think about it in the sense that it's probably about 7 feet up and pointed down just a little bit. Now, I did miss on having the chandelier. So this is a floor lamp, obviously not exactly the same thing, but I think it will be good enough. I'm just going to turn all of the objects of our scene purple so that we can kind of more easily see them versus our lighting. So now that we're here, we're going to get our first light, and this is the most important one, which is the light that lights the chandelier coming across from the right side And we want to make sure that this has a nice angle to it. Now, you could do a couple different things here. When thinking through this, and if you have, just light panels, LED light panels, you could use that. LED light panels are a relatively hard source depending on their exact size, but they're generally towards the harder side of things. That's why there's a bunch of, soft boxes and that kind of stuff. They can go with it, and diffuser filters and those kinds of things. You could use just LED panels. If you have something like the GVM P80S monolight type heads from anybody, those could work as well. Airy type Fresnels. There's a whole lot of different options you would have here, but you want something that's hard and doesn't necessarily have the widest cast possible. So I'm going to start by just using regular lamps here. In my head, I'm imagining these as GVM P80S units. And I imagine that in particular because I use those lamps a lot. I use them for most of my videos. They're lightweight. They don't have a lot of extra bells and whistles. They're bright enough, and they're cheap. And I do have an affiliate link for those down in the video description that if you want to pick up some for yourself, you can save 10% through GVM's website using my code. All of that's down in the video description. But that's just one option. If you're using aperture lights, all of what I'm saying is going to basically be the same because they're all monolights that produce a good amount of light, but are not necessarily being softened. If we want to soften things out, we can add our own modifiers. So basically what I've done here is I've put in the first two lamps. And like I said, you could use LED panels for this if that's what you have, but we are just trying to stay on the harder side of things. If you did want it to have a little bit more control of how hard it is, you could use something like a Fresnel on either or both of these lamps to help shape your light more. I think that would be reasonable. This is something that kind of to me looks like there's windows that are in each of these rooms that are open and really bright, especially because it kind of matches the tone coming in the front windows here. And because of that, it's, kind of implied that this is sunlight leaking into this hallway. I like using Fresnels to help mimic sunlight, and you can really dial it in from flood to spot to get an exact shape for your shadows. But if you don't have the money to get Fresnel lights or to get Fresnel lenses for Bowen's mount lamps, then you could do this with a reflector hood by itself. You would maybe get a little bit of a double shadow effect going though. So I'll talk about that more in just a minute. So we're going to have our first light path here. And like I said, this is kind of the most important one in my opinion. It's what creates this shadow. It kind of leads our eye up towards the center. So we're going to go like this and have it cast in this way. And here we can see how this shadow would be formed if this lamp was a little bit towards the ground and pointed up, just slightly. We can just tilt it incrementally to get this into the position we want it to be, adjusting the height and that tilt to find where this kind of shadow is made in a way that is distinct but not distracting. So I actually put the wrong door on that one. I meant to have it be this door. And you can see here, depending on your exact position, if you use a lamp that has a wide enough throw, you can cast some light onto the actual door itself, and that'll be adding some light into this room as well. So let's talk about our second lamp here. Now this is the one that's coming more straight across. Now the goal of this lamp, in my opinion, is to make sure that we get this shape on the floor. Now if you notice, this one does kind of fade off by the time we get into the center of the rug. So I'm going to bring this back a little bit, and you're going to then adjust the power and the angle. I would say that you could actually tilt this one down a little bit to adjust where the fall off actually occurs. The other thing I want to be sure of is to have this be wide enough that it gets cut off by the edges of the doorway and kind of, basically naturally flagged by the doorway itself. In this way, we get to have these distinct lines. In this way, I think this one is tilted up to get the shadow, and I think this one is tilted down to get the fall off in particular. I want to point out that the stairs here along the front edge do still have light that's falling onto them. And there is even a little reflection right here as if there's a light source that's coming from the left side. So I think that we're going to have to put in some type of artificial light. And so for that, I'm going to use a big sheet of diffusion, like a 4x4 or so. What I would want to do is get this up high, pretty much in line or slightly above the camera, and have it angled down just slightly. And that's going to help us get some general exposure for the entire room. It just really kind of casting generally so that we don't have issues with getting our exposure. If you don't mind your image being darker or having more contrast, or this is a little bit more out of your budget because it's the 4x4, you have to get it up high with a stand and you have the extra lamp. You know, if there's a reason for you not to have this, all you have to be able to do is tolerate having more contrast on the floor between the darker areas and those streaks of light coming in. So that would be something like this. Now I put the edge right here as the kind of the goal of the fall off about halfway up the stairs. And with this, you can see the banister's shadow just a little bit. So that's part of why I'm having it come from over here on the left side. But you don't want this to be so intense or so obvious that it creates its own lines across the floor. You want this to be very general and very kind of forgiving to the overall contrast of your image. Just really nice and diffused. And so then kind of the last thing that we want to take a look at is these actual windows at the front of the location. So I'm going to say that you could do this two ways. You could have even two lamps, both casting in, hidden by the wall and hidden by the door frame. That's definitely possible. You could even just have one that casts across the entire area, something like this. And so you could do this with these three lights all having reflector hoods instead of any extra modification. If you had a little bit more budget and you wanted a little bit more control, I would say that having a Fresnel at least on this lamp would be really nice. And that would help it be a little bit more of this like spotlight look. There is like a very circular nature to how this one looks. This one you don't see underneath the stairway, so you can't quite tell, but I think that that would be something that would also potentially help you make sure that these shadows are really sharp like this and kind of dial in it exactly to where you want it to be. If we're kind of talking about this as more of the higher budget version, I'm going to take away that diffusion frame and opt instead for a lantern, because this is maybe our more of a budget version. These are either lamps in terms of, mono heads or LED panels. And we're trying to maybe be a little bit more budget conscious, just using the reflector hoods. And now we're going to be using a lantern. This might have to be then moved in a little bit, depending on the wide angle of your camera. You'd have to maybe play with it just some. That would hopefully give you just enough extra light to be able to not have it be super contrasty between where these streaks are. Now, if this was something more like a night scene, you could then, black out the front window so it doesn't look like there's daylight out there. Maybe change the color temperature of these to be a little more artificial, and then get rid of this lantern and this lamp. And then you just have these streaks of light coming across your image, and that you could, make something a lot more scary looking with that kind of technique. If this one doesn't have enough soft light to actually make sure that you get your proper exposure, because you want this to be kind of daytime, this is middle to high key. You could also add a lantern or a space light on this side as well. I'm actually going to opt for the space light for this because that's a tool that I just recently added to my kit. Because I always say lantern or space light and use the lantern, but I've now just added a space light icon. And so that's pretty fun to be able to just use that now. And you know what? I'm going to take this and make this one into a Fresnel as well, just so that you can get a little extra shaping control if this one is going to be a higher budget solution. Now, because these are panes of glass and windows that you actually see in the scene, I'm not going to put a Fresnel out here just to still remain a little bit lower budget, because I don't mind having the reflector hood have that kind of double shadow effect, because lots of times panes of glass do create a double shadow effect by themselves. So it would look, natural enough if that was occurring here. If you had to have somebody open this doorway to be, entering the scene, you could put this lamp up on a boom arm or something of the sort to get it above the doorway right about here, and kind of behind. Right now, I just have it on a stand off to the side because that's easy. If this is a real location, likelihood also is that you are going to be getting nice sunlight coming through these windows as well, depending exactly on the time of day that you shoot, but that shouldn't be such a problem. If you were using a backdrop back here because this was some sort of set, then you would need to have lights that light that backdrop. But since I'm kind of going for a more budget look here, let's say that you've got to rent this location instead of having to have a studio and all the craftspeople to actually make this level of architecture for, your film. I think it's more realistic for the purposes of our conversation to talk about it as a rented location and how we're going to be lighting it. But this kind of look where you have doorways and lights that are casting from the side into the main space is one of my favorite little tricks to get more light into your scene and to just add some more shape overall, because all of those then become sort of implied motivated sources rather than having it maybe look a little bit more unnatural. Now, I don't necessarily think the natural lighting is the end all be all. So you could also take these if, we're doing that scary scene like we were talking about, and you could take those streaks and turn them red. You could turn them blue. You could make them more abstract to really get into more of a feeling or a psychology of your character as well. So there's lots of different things we can do here, but I think that it's always a really neat way to hide your lights is by just having them be coming from side rooms and have people pass through that pocket of light. And as I said at the beginning, if you need just a little bit more light, or maybe this is that night scene like we were just talking about, you could turn this chandelier on also, and that would give you just a little bit more light. If you wanted it to also be lit and really look like it was having a lot of influence on the scene, you could totally have another Fresnel that's off to the side here that is casting upwards, aimed directly at the ceiling above it and bouncing light off the ceiling right here to really just kind of be motivated by the chandelier's cast. That's something that's a popular technique, and I always think is a fun way to add a little bit more light to your scene. But that's only if you want to have that be turned on in your scene. So there we go. We have two different ways to light this Tennessee entrance hall type scene, a slightly more budget version and a slightly higher budget version here. Both of these offer some distinct advantages or compromises, but really this isn't an incredibly expensive scene to light because at minimum, you really just need 4 lamps to start with, and 1 modifier. Really, the most costly thing here would be your location because this is a pretty swell looking place. So as I said at the beginning, if you want to get my Filmmaker Tools template, you can go over to my Patreon. That's linked down in the video's description and pick that up for yourself. Draw.io is free and open source as well, and that's also linked down below. While you're on my Patreon, if you want to join to help support these kinds of lighting diagrams and my general cinematography videos, I have tiers that start at just $2 a month. Thank you to everybody who's already supporting me over there. I really appreciate it. My next goal is to get about 30 people between the free and the paid tiers. If you want to pick up the kinds of tools that I've been talking about for making a scene like this, I have affiliate links down in the video's description. Those help support this channel as well. Like I said, if you want to get into the GVM gear, you can use my coupon code that's down there as well to save 10% on your order. If you like videos like this, please give me a like. It really helps me with reaching new people using the YouTube algorithm who also like these kinds of lighting, cinematography, and just general filmmaking type videos. I have weekly videos that come out that go over all sorts of types of cinematography and lighting techniques. Thank you so much for watching. I really always appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, take care of people around you, and I hope that you have a wonderful week ahead of you.